Hello, my name's Mrs. Fitzsimons. I'm a science teacher, and here I am in one of the science labs. So if you have science, you may have me for your lesson when you come in September. I'm also a head of year. So you will see me if you come into the pastoral office to speak to your head of year or to speak to a pastoral manager. And I'm going to read chapter 29. I spent my last weekend saying silent goodbyes. I visited every one of my favourite spots: library, swimming pool, cinema, parks, football stadium. I went to some of the places with Mum or Dad, some with Alan Morris or Tommy Jones. I would have liked to spend time with Steve, but couldn't bear to face him. I got the feeling every so often that I was being followed, and the hairs in the back of my neck stood on end. But whenever I turned to look, nobody was there. Eventually, I put it down to nerves and ignored it. I treated every minute with my family and friends as if it was special. I paid close attention to their faces and voices, so I would never forget. I knew I'd never see these people again, and that tore me apart inside, but it was the way it had to be. There was no going back. They could do nothing wrong that weekend. Mum's kisses didn't embarrass me. Dad's orders didn't bother me. Alan's stupid jokes didn't annoy me. I spent more time with Annie than with anybody else. I was going to miss her the most. I gave her piggyback rides and swung her round by the arms and took her to the football stadium with me and Tommy. I even played with her dolls. Sometimes I felt like crying. I'd look at Mum or Dad or Annie and realise how much I loved them, how empty my life would be without them. I had to turn aside at moments like that and take long, deep breaths. A couple of times that didn't work, and I rushed away to cry in private. I think they guessed something was wrong. Mum came into my room that Saturday night and stayed for ages, tucking me into bed, telling me stories, listening to me talk. It had been years since we spent any time together like that. I felt sorry after she'd gone that we hadn't had more nights like this. In the morning, Dad asked if there was anything I wanted to discuss with him. He said I was a growing lad and would be going through lots of changes, and he'd understand if I had mood swings or wanted to go off by myself, but he would always be there for me to talk to. You'll be there, but I won't be. I felt like crying, but I kept quiet, nodded my head, and thanked him. I behaved as perfectly as possible. I wanted to leave a final impression, so they would remember me as a good son, a good brother, a good friend. I didn't want anybody thinking badly of me when I was gone. Dad was going to take us out to a restaurant for dinner that Sunday, but I asked if we could stay home to eat. This would be my last meal with them, and I wanted it to be special. When I was looking back on it in later years, I wanted to be able to remember us together at home, a happy family. Mum cooked my favourite food: chicken, roast potatoes, corn on the cob. Annie and me had freshly squeezed orange juice to drink. Mum and Dad shared a bottle of wine. We had strawberry cheesecake for dessert. Everybody was in good form. We sang songs. Dad cracked terrible jokes. Mum played a tune with a pair of spoons. Annie recited a few poems. Everybody joined in for a game of charades. It was a day I wished would never end. But of course, all days must. And finally, as it always does, the sun dropped and the darkness of night crept across the sky. Dad looked up after a while, then at his watch. Time for bed, he said. You two have school in the morning. No, I thought, I don't have school ever again. That should have cheered me up. But all I could think was, no school means no Mr. Dalton, no friends, no football, no school trips. I delayed going to bed as long as I could. I spent ages taking off my clothes and putting on my pyjamas. Longer still, washing my hands and face and teeth. Then, when it could be avoided, I went downstairs to the living room where Mum and Dad were talking. They looked up, surprised to see me. You all right, Darren? Mum asked. I'm fine, I said. You're not feeling sick? I'm fine, I assured her. I just wanted to say goodnight. I put my arms around Dad, then kissed him on the cheek. Next, I did the same with Mum. Good night, I said to each. This is one for the books, Dad laughed, rubbing his cheek where I kissed him. How long since you kissed the two of us goodnight, Angie? Too long, Mum smiled, patting my head. I love you, I told them. I know I haven't said it very often, but I do. I love both of you and always will. We love you too, Mum said. Don't we, Dermot? Of course we do, Dad said. Well, tell him, she insisted. Dad sighed. I love you, Darren, he said, rolling his eyes in a way he knew would make me laugh. Then he gave me a hug. Really, I do, he said, serious this time. I left then. I stood outside the door a while, listening to them talk, reluctant to depart. What do you think brought that on, Mum asked. Kids, Dad snorted. Who knows how their minds work? There's something up, Mum said. He's been acting oddly for some time now. Maybe he's got a girlfriend, Dad suggested. Maybe, Mum said, but didn't sound convinced. I'd lingered long enough. I was afraid if I waited any longer, I might rush into the room and tell them what was really the matter. If I did, they'd stop me from going ahead with Mr. Crepsley's plan. They'd say that vampires weren't real and fight to keep me with them in spite of the danger. I thought of Annie and how close I'd come to biting her, and I knew I must not let them stop me. I trudged upstairs to my room. It was a warm night and the window was open. That was important. Mr. Crepsley was waiting in the wardrobe. He emerged when he heard me closing the door. It is stuffy in there, he complained. I feel sorry for Madame Octa, having had to spend so much time in. Shut up, I told him. No need to be rude, he sniffed. I was merely passing a comment. Well, don't, I said. You might not think much of this place, but I do. This has been my home, my room, my wardrobe, ever since I can remember. And I'm never going to say it again after tonight. This is my last little while here. So don't bite it, all right? I'm sorry, he said. I took one last look around the room, then sighed unhappily. I pulled a bag out from underneath the bed and handed it to Mr. Crepsley. What is this? He asked suspiciously. Some personal stuff, I told him. My diary, a picture of my family. A couple of other bits and pieces. Nothing that will be missed. Will you mind it for me? Yes, he said. But only if you promise not to look through it, I said. Vampires have no secrets from each other, he said. But when he saw my face, he tutted lightly and shrugged. I will not open it, he promised. All right, I said, taking a deep breath. Do you have the potion? He nodded and handed over a small dark bottle. I looked inside. The liquid was dark and thick and foul-smelling. Mr. Crepsley moved behind me, and I laid his hands on my neck. You sure this will work? I asked nervously. Trust me, he said. I always thought a broken neck meant people couldn't walk or move, I said. No, he replied. The bones of the neck do not matter. Paralysis only happens if the spinal cord, a long muscle running down the middle of the neck, breaks. I would be careful not to damage it. Do the doctors think it's odd? I asked. They will not check, he said. The potion will slow your heart down so much they will be sure that you are dead. They will find the broken neck and put two and two together. If you were older, they might go ahead with an autopsy. But no doctor likes cutting a child open. Now, you're totally clear on what is going to happen and how you must act, he asked. Yes, I said. There must be no mistakes, he warned. If you make just one slip, our plans will fall apart. I am not a fool. I know what to do, I snapped. Then do it, he said. So I did. With one angry gesture, I swallowed the contents of the bottle. I grimaced at the taste, then shuddered as my body started to stiffen. There wasn't much pain, but an icy feeling spread through my bones and veins. My teeth began to chatter. It took about 10 minutes for the poison to work its deadly charms. At the end of that time, I couldn't move any of my limbs. My lungs weren't working. Well, they were, but very, very slowly. And my heart had stopped. Again, not fully, but enough for its beat to be undetectable. I'm going to snap the neck now, Mr. Crepsley said, and I heard a quick clicking sound as he jerked my head to one side. I couldn't feel anything. My senses were dead. There, he said. That should do it. Now I'm going to toss you out of the window. He carried me over and stood there a moment with me, breathing in the night air. I have to toss you hard enough to make it look genuine, he said. You might break some bones in the fall. They will start hurting when the potion wears off after a few days, but I will fix them up later on. Here we go. He picked me up, paused a moment, then hurled me out and down. I fell quickly, the house whizzing past in a blur, and landed heavily on my back. My eyes were open, and I found myself staring at a drain at the foot of the house. For a while, my body went undetected, so I lay there, listening to the sounds of the night. In the end, a passing neighbour spotted me and investigated. I couldn't see his face, but I heard his gasp when he turned me over and saw my lifeless body. He rushed straight round to the front of the house and pounded on the door. I could hear his voice as he shouted for my mother and father, then their voices as he led them round back. They thought he was pulling their leg or had been mistaken. My father was marching angrily and muttering to himself. The footsteps stopped when they rounded the bend and saw me. For a long, terrible moment, there was complete silence. Then Dad and Mum rushed forward and picked me up. "Darren!" Mum screamed, clutching me to her chest. "Let go, Angie!" Dad shouted, prying me free and laying me down on the grass. "What's wrong with him, Dermot?" Mum wailed. "I don't know. He must have fallen." Dad stood up and gazed at my open bedroom window. I could see his hands flexing into fists. "He's not moving," Mum said calmly, then grabbed me and shook me fiercely. "He's not moving!" she screamed. "He's not moving. He's..." Dad once again eased her hands away. He beckoned our neighbour over and handed Mum to him. "Take her inside," he said softly. "Ring for an ambulance. I'll stay here and look after Darren." "Is he dead?" our neighbour asked. Mum moaned loudly when he said it and buried her face in her hands. Dad shook his head softly. "No," he said, giving Mum's shoulder a light squeeze. "He's just paralysed, like his friend was." Mum lowered her hands. "Like Steve?" she asked half hopefully. "Yes," Dad smiled, "and he'll snap out of it like Steve. Now go ring for help, okay?" Mum nodded, then hurried away with our neighbour. Dad held his smile until she was out of sight, then bent over me, checked my eyes and felt my wrist for a pulse. When he found no sign of life, he laid me back down, brushed a lock of hair out of my eyes, then did something I never expected to see. He started to cry. And that was how I came to enter a new miserable phase of my life, namely death.
I'm an academic learning mentor at St Cuthbert. I'm going to be reading chapter 30 of Circuit Break. It didn't take the doctors long to pronounce their verdict. They couldn't find any breath or pulse or movement. It was an open and shut case as far as they were concerned. The worst thing was knowing what was going on around me. I wished that I'd asked Mr. Krebs to give me another potion, which could have put me to sleep. It was terrible, hearing Mum and Dad crying, Annie screaming for me to come back. Friends of the family began arriving after a couple of hours, the queue for more sobbing and moans. I'd have loved to avoid this. I would have rather run away with Mr. Krebs in the middle of the night, but he told me that that wasn't possible. "If you run away," he said, "they would follow. There would be posters up everywhere, pictures in the papers, and with the police, we would know no peace. Faking my death was the only way. If they thought I was dead, I'd be free. Nobody comes searching for a dead person." Now, as I heard the sadness, I cursed both Mr. Krebs and myself. I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have put them through this. Still, looking on the bright side, at least this would be the end of it. They were sad and would be for some time, but they would get over it eventually, I hoped. If I'd run away, the misery could have lasted forever. They might have lived the rest of their lives hoping I'd come back, searching, believing I would one day return. The undertaker arrived and cleared the room of visitors. He and a nurse undressed me and examined my body. Some of my senses were returning and I could feel his cold hands prodding and poking me. "He's in excellent condition," he said softly to the nurse. "Firm, fresh and unmarked. I'll have very little to do with this one, just some rouge to make him look a little redder around the cheeks." He rolled up my eyelids. He was a chubby, happy-looking man. I was afraid he'd spot light in my eyes, but he didn't. All he did was roll my head gently from side to side, which made the broken bones in my neck creak. "So fragile a creature is man," he sighed, and then went ahead with the rest of the examination. They took me back home that night and laid me in the living room on a long table with a large cloth spread across it, so people could come and say goodbye. It was weird hearing all those people discussing me as though I wasn't there, talking about my life and what I'd been like as a baby, and how fine a boy I was, and what a good man I would have grown up to be if I'd lived. What a shock they'd have got if I leaped up and shouted boo. Time dragged. I don't think I can explain how boring it was, so I still for hours on end, unable to move or laugh or scratch my nose. I couldn't even stare at the ceiling because my eyes were shut. I had to be careful as feelings returned to my body. Mr. Krebs told me that this would happen, that tingles and itches would start. long before I fully recovered. I couldn't move, but if I made a real effort, I could have twitched a little, which might have given the game away. The itches nearly drove me mad. I tried ignoring them, but it was impossible. They were everywhere, scampering up and down my body like tiny spiders. They were worse around my head and neck, where the bones had snapped. People finally began leaving. It must have been late, because soon the room was empty and totally silent. I lay there by myself for a time, enjoying the quiet. And then I heard a noise. The door to the room was opening, very slowly and very quietly. Footsteps crossed the room and stopped by the table. My insides went cold, and it wasn't because of the potion. Who was here? For a moment I thought it might be Mr. Crepsley, but he had no reason to come creeping into the house. We were set to meet at a later date. Whoever it was, he or she, was keeping very quiet. For a couple of minutes there was no sound at all. Then I felt hands on my face. He raised my eyelids and shone a small torch onto my pupils. The room was too dark for me to see who he was. He grunted, lowered the lid, then pried open my mouth and laid something on my tongue. It felt like a piece of thin paper, but it had a strange, bitter taste. After removing the object from my mouth, he picked up my hands and examined the fingertips. Next there was the sound of the camera taking photos. Finally, he stuck a sharp object, it felt like a needle, into me. He was careful not to prick me in places where I would bleed, and stayed away from my vital organs. My senses had partially returned, but not fully, so the needle didn't cause much pain. After that, he left. I heard his footsteps crossing the room, as quietly as before, then the door opening and closing, and that was that. The visitor, whoever it had been, was gone, leaving me puzzled and a bit scared. Early the next morning, Dad came in and sat with me. He spoke for a long time, telling me all the things he'd had planned for me, the college I would have gone to, the job he'd wanted for me. He cried a lot. Towards the end, Mum came in and sat with him. They cried on each other's shoulders and tried to comfort themselves. They said they still had Annie and could maybe have another child or adopt one. At least it had been quick and I hadn't been in pain, and they would always have their memories. I hated being the cause of so much hurt. I would have given anything in the world to spare them this. There was a lot of activity later that day. A coffin was brought in and I was laid inside. A priest came and sat with the family and their friends. People streamed in and out of the room. I heard Annie crying, begging for me to stop fooling and sit up. It would have been much easier if they'd taken her away, but I guess they didn't want her to grow up feeling they'd robbed her of the chance to say goodbye to her brother. Finally, the lid was placed on the coffin and screwed into place. I was lifted off the table and led out to the hearse. We drove slowly to the church, where I couldn't hear much of what was being said. Then, with mass out of the way, they carried me to the graveyard, where I could hear every word of the priest's speech and the sobs and moans of the mourners. And then they buried me.
Hello, I'm Miss Monks, part of the PE department, and I'm going to be reading for you chapter 31. All sounds faded away as they lowered me down the dark, dank hole. There was a jolt where the coffin hit bottom, then the rain-like sound of the first handfuls of soil being tossed upon the lid. There was a long silence after that, until the grave diggers began shoveling the earth back onto the grave. The first few clods fell like bricks. The heavy, dull thud shook the coffin. As the grave filled and the earth piled up between me and the topside world, the sounds of the living grew softer, until finally they were only far-away muffles. At the end there were faint pounding noises as they patted the mound of earth flat, and then complete silence. I lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the earth settle, imagining the sound of worms crawling towards me through the dirt. I thought it'd be very scary, but actually it was quite peaceful. I felt safe down here, protected from the world. I spent the time thinking about the last few weeks, the flyer for the freak show, the strange force that had made me close my eyes and reach blindly for the ticket, the first glimpse of the dark theatre, the cool balcony where I watched Steve talking with Mr. Crepsley. There were so many vital moments. If I'd missed the ticket, I wouldn't be here. If I hadn't gone to the show, I wouldn't be here. If I hadn't stuck around to see what Steve was up to, I wouldn't be here. If I hadn't stolen Madame Octa, I wouldn't be here. If I'd said no to Mr. Crepsley's offer, I wouldn't be here. A world of ifs, but it made no difference. What was done was done. If only I could go back in time. But I couldn't. The past was behind me. The best thing now would be to stop looking over my shoulder. It was time to forget the past and to look for the present and the future. As the hours passed, movement returned. It came to my fingers first, which curled into fist, then slipped from my chest where they'd been crossed by the undertaker. I flexed them several times, slowly working the itches out of my palms. My eyes opened next, but that wasn't much good. Open or closed, it was all the same down here. Perfect darkness. The feelings brought pain. My back ached from where I'd fallen out of the window. My lungs and heart, having been out of the habit of beating, hurt. My legs were cramped, my neck was stiff. The only part of me which escaped the pain was my right big toe. It was when I started breathing that I began to worry about the air in the coffin. Mr. Crepsley had said that I could survive for a week into my coma-like state. I didn't need to eat or use a toilet or breathe. But now that my breath was back, I became aware of the small amount of air and how quickly I was using it up. I didn't panic. Panic will make me gasp and use more air. I remained calm and breathed softly. Lay as still as I could. Movement makes you breathe more. I had no way of knowing the time. I tried counting inside my head but kept losing track of the numbers and having to go back and start over. I sang silent songs to myself and told stories beneath my breath. I wish they'd buried me with TV or radio, but I guess there's not much call for such item among the dead. Finally, after what seemed like several centuries stacked on top of each other, the sounds of digging reached my ears. He dug quicker than any human, so fast it seemed it wasn't digging at all, but rather sucking the soil out. He reached me in what must have been record time, less than a quarter of an hour. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't a moment too soon. He knocked 3 times on the coffin lid, then started unscrewing it. I took a couple of minutes, then threw the lid wide open and found myself staring up at the most beautiful night sky I'd ever seen. I took a deep breath and sat up, coughing. It was a fairly dark night, but after spending so much time underground, it seemed bright as day to me. "Are you all right?" Mr. Crepsley asked. "I feel dead tired," I grinned weakly. He smiled at that joke. "Stand up so I can examine you," he said. I winced and stood. I had pins and needles all over. He ran his fingers lightly up my back and then over my front. "You were lucky," he said. "No broken bones, just a bit of bruising which will die down after a couple of days." He pulled himself out of the grave, then reached down and gave me a hand up. I was still pretty stiff and sore. "I feel like a pincushion that's been squashed," I complained. "It will take a few days after the after effects to pass," he said. "But don't worry, you're in good shape, and we're lucky that they buried you today. If they waited another day to put you under, you'd be feeling much worse." He hopped back onto the grave and closed the coffin lid. When he emerged, he picked up a shovel and began tossing the earth back in. "Do you want me to help?" I asked. "No," he said. You would slow me down. Go for a stroll and walk some of the stiffness out of your bones. I will call when I'm ready to move on." "Did you bring my bag?" I asked. He nodded at a nearby headstone from which the bag was hanging. I got the bag and checked it to see if he'd searched it. There was no sign of his having invaded my privacy, but I couldn't tell for sure. I'd just have to take his word for it. Anyway, it didn't matter much. There was nothing in my diary he didn't already know. I went for a walk amongst the graves, testing my limbs, shaking my legs and arms, enjoying it. Any feeling, even pins and needles, was better than none at all. My eyes were stronger than ever before. I was able to read names and dates on headstones from several metres away. It was the vampire blood in me. After all, didn't vampires spend their whole lives in the dark? I knew I was only half vampire, but all the suddenly. As I was thinking about my new powers, a hand reached out from behind one of the graves, wrapped itself around my mouth and dragged me down the ground and out of sight of Mr. Crepsley. I shook my head and opened my mouth to scream, but there was something that stopped me dead in my tracks. My attacker, whoever he was, had a hammer and a large wooden stake, the tip of which was pointing directly at my heart.
Hello, I'm Mrs. Bowden and I'm your teacher at St. Cuthbert's. If you move even a fraction, my attacker warned, I'll drive this right through you without blinking. The chilling words didn't have half as much impact on me as the familiar voice which uttered them. Steve? I gasped, glancing up from the tip of the stake to find his face. It was him, sure enough, trying to look brave, but really quite terrified. Steve, what the... I began, but he cut me short with a poke of the stake. Not a word, he hissed, crouching down behind the stone pillar. I don't want your friend overhearing. Oh, you mean Mr. Crepsley? I said. Latin Crepsley Berhorston, Steve sneered. I don't care what you call him. He's a vampire, and that's all that bothers me. What are you doing here? I whispered. Vampire hunting, he growled, prodding me again with the stake. And looky here. Seems like I found me a pair. Listen, I said, more annoyed than worried. If he was going to kill me, he would have done it immediately, not sit around talking first like they do in the movies. If you're going to stick that thing in me, do it. If you want to talk, put it away. I'm sore enough as it is without you making new holes in me. He stared, then pulled the stake back a few centimetres. Why are you here? I asked. How did you know to come? I was following you, he said. I followed you all weekend after seeing what you did to Alan. I saw Crepsley going into your house, and I saw him toss you out the window. You're the one who sneaked into the living room, I gasped, remembering the mysterious late-night visitor. Yes, he nodded. The doctors were very quick to sign your death certificate. I wanted to check myself to see if you were still ticking. The piece of paper in my mouth, I asked. Litmus paper, he said. It changes colour when you stick it on a damp surface. When you stick it on a living body. That and the marks on your fingers tipped me off. You know about the marks on the fingers? I asked, amazed. I read about it in a very old book, he said. The same one, in fact, that I found Barhausen's portrait in. There was no mention of it anywhere else, so I thought it was just another vampire myth. But then I studied your fingers, and he stopped and cocked his head. I realised I could no longer hear digging sounds. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mr. Crepsley's voice hissed across the graveyard. Darren, where are you? He called. Darren? Steve's face collapsed with fear. I could hear his heart beating as with the beads of sweat rolling down his cheeks. He didn't know what to do. He hadn't thought this through. I'm fine, I shouted, causing Steve to jump. Where are you? Mr. Crepsley asked. Over here, I replied, standing, ignoring Steve's stake. My legs were weak, so I lay down for a minute. Are you all right? He asked. I'm fine. I'll rest a bit more, then try again. Give me a shout when you're ready. I squatted back down so I was face to face with Steve. He didn't look so brave any longer. The tip of the stake was pointing down at the ground, a threat no more, and his whole body sagged miserably. I felt sorry for him. Why did you come here, Steve? I asked. To kill you, he said. To kill me? For heaven's sake, why? I asked. You're a vampire, he said. What other reason do I need? But you've got nothing against vampires. You wanted to become one. Yes, he snarled. I wanted to, but you're the one who did. You planned this all along, didn't you? You told him that I was evil. You made him reject me so that you could... Oh, you're talking nonsense, I sighed. I never wanted to become a vampire. I only agreed to join him in order to save your life. You would have died if I hadn't become his assistant. A likely story. To think I used to believe you were my friend. I am your friend, I cried. Steve, you don't understand. I would never do anything to harm you. I hate what's happened to me. I only did it to spare me the sob story, he sniffed. How long were you planning this? You must have gone to him that night at the freak show. That's how you got Madame Octo, wasn't it? He gave her you in return for you becoming his assistant. No, Steve, that's not true. You mustn't believe that. But he did believe it. I could see it in his eyes. Nothing I said was going to change his opinion. As far as he was concerned, I'd betrayed him. I'd stolen the life that he should have had. He would never forgive me. I'm going now, he said, starting to crawl away. I thought I'd be able to kill you tonight, but I was wrong. I'm too young, I'm not strong enough, and I'm not brave enough. But heed this, Danshan, he said. I'll grow. I'll get older and stronger and braver. I'm going to devote my entire life to developing my body and my mind. And when the day comes when I'm ready, when I'm fully equipped and properly prepared, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you, he vowed. I'm going to become the world's best vampire hunter, and there won't be a single hole you can find that I won't be able to find you to. Not a hole, nor a nook, nor a cellar. I'll track you to the ends of the earth if I have to, he said, his face glowing madly. You and your mentor, when I find you, I'll drive steel-tipped stakes through your hearts, chop off your heads, and fill them with garlic. Then I'll burn you to ashes and scatter you across the running water. I won't take any chances. I'll make sure you never come back from the grave again. He paused, produced a knife, and cut a small cross into the flesh of his left palm. He held it up so I could see the blood dripping from the wound. On this blood, I so swear it, he declared. Then he turned and ran, disappearing in seconds into the shadow of the night. I could have run after him, following that trail of blood. If I'd called Mr. Crepsley, we could have tracked him down and put an end to both Steve, Leopard, and his threats. It would have been the wise thing to do. But I didn't. I couldn't. He was my friend.
Hi, New Year 7. My name's Mrs. Knight. I'm a history teacher and assistant head teacher. I'm going to read chapter 33, the last chapter. Mr. Crepsley was smoothing over the mound of earth when I returned. I watched him work. The shovel was large and heavy, but he handled it as if it was made out of paper. I wondered how strong he was and how strong I would one day be. I considered telling him about Steve, but was afraid he'd go after him. Steve had suffered enough. Besides, his threat was an idle one. He'd forget about me and Mr. Crepsley in a few weeks when something new grabbed his attention. I hoped. Mr. Crepsley looked up and frowned. Are you sure you're all right? He asked. You seem very uptight. So would you if you'd spent the day in a coffin, I replied. He laughed out loud. Master Shan, I have spent more time in coffins than many of the truly dead. He gave the grave one last hard whack, then broke the shovel into little pieces and tossed them away. Is the stiffness wearing off? He asked. It's better than it was, I said, twisting my arms and waist. I wouldn't like to fake my death too often, though. No, he mused. Well, hopefully it will not be necessary again. It's a dangerous stunt. Many things can go wrong. I stared at him. You told me I'd be safe as houses, I said. I lied. The potion sometimes drives its patients too far towards death, and they never recover. And I could not be sure they would not perform an autopsy on you. And, do you want to hear all this? He asked. No, I said sickly, I don't. I took an angry swing at him. He ducked out of the way easily, laughing as he did. You told me it was safe, I shouted. You lied. I had to, he said. There was no other way. What if I died? I snapped. He shrugged. I would be down one assistant. No great loss. I'm sure I could have found another. Oh! I kicked the ground angrily. There were lots of things I could have called him, but I didn't like using bad language in the presence of the dead. I'd tell him what I thought about his trickery later. Are you ready to go? He asked. Give me a minute, I said. I jumped up on one of the taller headstones and gazed around at the town. I couldn't see much from here, but this would be my last glimpse of the place where I'd been born and lived. So I took my time and treated every dark alley as a posh cul-de-sac, every crumbling bungalow as a sheikh's palace, every two-story building as a skyscraper. You grow used to leaving after a time, Mr. Crepsley said. He was standing on the stone behind me, perched on little more than air. His face was gloomy. Vampires are always saying goodbye. We never stop anywhere very long. We're forever picking up our roots and moving on to pastures new. It is our way. Is the first time the hardest? I asked. Yes, he said, nodding. But it never gets easy. How long before I get used to it? I wanted to know. Maybe a few decades, he said, maybe longer. Decades. He said it like he was talking about months. Can we never make friends? I asked. Can we never have homes or wives or families? No, he sighed. Never. Does it get lonely? I asked. Terribly so, he admitted. I nodded sadly. At least he was being truthful. As I've said before, I'd always rather the truth, however unpleasant it may be, than a lie. You know where you stand with the truth. Okay, I said, hopping down. I'm ready. I picked up my bag and dusted some graveyard dirt from it. You may ride on my back if you wish, Mr. Crepsley offered. No, thank you, I replied politely. Maybe later, but I'd rather walk the stiffness out of my legs first. Very well, he said. I rubbed my belly and I listened to it growl. I haven't eaten since Sunday. I told him, I'm hungry. Me too, he said. Then he took my hand in his, grinned bloodthirstily. Let us go eat. Took a deep breath, tried not to think about what will be on the menu, and nodded nervously and squeezed his hand. We turned and faced away from the graves, then side by side, the vampire and his assistant, we began walking into the night.
Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Shields and I'm head teacher at St Cuthbert's, and I cannot wait to meet all of you in September. I know you've been following this story with us and you've had a chance to get to see some of the teachers that you will get to know very well when you come to St Cuthbert's in September. I really hope you've enjoyed this and that you've appreciated sharing this read with us, and we are looking forward to September. We can't wait to see you. We really want to have you in the building and to get to know you and to help you to start your life at St Cuthbert's as soon as possible. Have a great summer and we'll see you very soon.